without further ado, my name is Heather Page, and I am an assistant professor of oceanography with C. I'm going to start off this talk with a little bit about my journey and how I got to where I am today, before diving into discussions about coral reefs, specifically Caribbean reefs, in a changing ocean. And see if I can get the slide. So before I tell you guys all about me, I want to hear all about you. And so we do have a couple of live polls at the beginning of this talk. So if you're able to participate in the live polls, I would love to hear about who we have on the call here today. So there's two different ways you can join the poll. You can either open up a web browser and go to this website here, pollev.com, and enter Heather Page 270 and then respond to the activities. You can also simply text on your phone to participate in the polls. So you can text Heather Page 270 to the phone number 37607 in order to participate in the polls. So the first poll I'm interested in hearing about is which category you most closely identify with. So I'm going to leave this screen up just for a couple minutes so we can see responses as they come in. So it looks like we have a handful of undergraduate students, some professionals in marine-related fields. We also have a number of people who are just here because they love the ocean. One college professor. And I forgot to mention this, but if you're having issues with the audio or the sound, please make a comment in the chat box so myself or Carrie can troubleshoot these issues. We're still getting some responses here. We have a few prospective undergraduate students. Welcome. Wow. We have a very mixed audience here, it looks like. Some very young people on this call, K-12 students, some prospective high school and undergraduate students, as well as a variety of other professionals and people who just love the ocean. Okay. Hopefully everyone was able to do that. I am going to lock this poll now. We can't have answers. All right, so great, thank you for that feedback. Okay, I guess the text poll is not activated, so you'll have to use your web browser. And so to use the web browser, you just go to this website shown on the top of the slide. So now if you're an SEA alum, I would love to hear which class you were part of. So this should look kind of like the numbers you see on the screen. It'll be either a W, S, or a C followed by 3 numbers. For those of you who are not alums, the letter at the beginning of this represents one of our sailing school vessels, and the 3-digit number represents what cruise the students were part of. So we've got a nice variety. We have some people that were on our original sailing school vessel, which is the Westward. I think Westward, I think I saw Westward 69, might have been the earliest one. If people can't remember the number, that's fine. We're happy to have you as part of the community. Okay. It looks like we have a nice variety. We've got a few people from C to 89. Hopefully this talk is a review for you guys, but hopefully it'll be a good review. Nice. Well, we're always happy to hear from the alums of SEA, and we're really glad you're able to join us today. I'm going to now have a couple more from colleague sales. All right, I'm going to now lock this poll, so there will be no more responses. All right, thank you guys for that feedback. And now I would like you guys to tell you guys a little bit about my journey and how I got to where I am today. I always love hearing about people's origin stories, so hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. I decided I was going to be a marine biologist at the ripe old age of 9, despite growing up in the Midwest where there are no oceans. So my family took a vacation to Florida, and the very first time I stepped foot in the ocean, I got stung by a jellyfish. And this may seem like an unconventional beginning, but it literally zapped the spark of interest in marine life and the oceans and science in general. So I did many science fairs growing up. This photo is actually from an experiment I did testing chemistry of drinking water, which is not much different than what I do now as an oceanographer. And participating in week-long camps at Marine Lab in Key Largo and volunteering at Newport Aquarium during high school really solidified my decision to pursue marine biology and conservation. So I moved away from home to live on the coast and attend University of North Carolina, Wilmington for my undergraduate education. Go Seahawks. Here I pursued Bachelor of Science degrees in marine biology and environmental sciences. I was fortunate enough to have many opportunities through summer internships and through my university to really get my hands and feet wet and a little muddy, as you can see from this slide, through a number of research experiences. So Newport Aquarium had a husbandry internship where I learned how to take care of animals in tanks. And then I did 2 research internships at Bodega Marine Laboratory in California and Kodiak Fisheries Research Center in Alaska, as well as a number of research experiences at UNCW. And in addition to research, I had the opportunity to do 2 short-term study abroad trips. Unfortunately, neither one was with SEA, but these study abroad trips were really transformative experiences that not only helped shape me as a scientist, but as a person living in this big wide world that we live in. So for any budding marine biologists or oceanographers on this call, I would highly, highly recommend you get your hands wet as early as possible. And if you do have the opportunity to study abroad, take it. 4 years of school just wasn't enough for me. So I attended Scripps Institution of Oceanography for my graduate education. My research examined ocean acidification on coral reefs. Specifically, I was interested in how the biological processes on the coral reef were affecting the seawater chemistry, and then in turn, how changes in seawater chemistry affect the animals living on the reef. In addition to research, I also became extremely involved with education, and I had the chance to participate in a 5-week-long research cruise, which, as you can tell from this picture, was in a much colder place than I'm used to. After finishing my PhD, I spent about 1.5 years in the Florida Keys at MOAT's International Center for Coral Reef Research and Restoration, where I studied the effects of ocean acidification on species interactions common to reef ecosystems. So this is where I was trying to study and understand how ecosystems would respond to environmental change. And then I just have 2 short videos here. So one of the, let me turn off this one, okay. So one of the experiments we did was looking at how ocean acidification affected the ability of larval Caribbean spiny lobsters to smell and orient towards chemical cues that are critical for settlement. And so to do this, we first had to conduct plankton tows off a bridge in the Florida Keys to try to catch these larval lobsters from the water column. We did not actually catch lobsters in this particular plankton tow, but it gives you an example of some of the really cool animals that live in the plankton, including this larval eel that we see swimming around. In another series of experiments we did, we tried to understand how urchin might be affected by ocean acidification. So we put urchins in these test tubes, and basically at one end of this choice chamber, there's a algae, which is their food source, and the other side is empty. And we basically just filmed them for an hour watching to see which side they would choose and to see if they could still find food under acidified conditions. And in both of these experiments, we found that ocean acidification does actually disrupt the ability of marine organisms to smell chemical cues in the water for settlement and for food. So I won't have time to really talk about these in detail today, but if you have questions at the end, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And that brings me to SEA. So I joined Sea Education Association last summer as part of the oceanography team. I'm thrilled and humbled to be part of such an amazing community of ocean stewards. I look forward to continuing to be part of this community. So these are just some photographs from 2 trips I did last year. I actually joined one of the high school programs last summer as a deckhand, and this is a photograph of the Corvus Kramer in the background with some tidal ecosystems in the foreground. And the rest of these pictures are all from the Caribbean Reef Expedition that was held last fall. Okay. So now we're going to dive into coral reefs. So coral reefs are formed primarily by stony or scleractinian corals. Stony corals are animals that are closely related to jellyfish and anemones, and they are made of thousands of individual living polyps. So in this close-up image of this coral colony, you can see the many polyps that are living together. Each of these polyps is a clone of one another, and they all live together as one coral colony, which is the picture you see on the left. The coral's yellow-green color actually comes from a tiny microscopic dinoflagellate algae that lives inside of its tissues. And coral tissue is transparent, so the color of the algae actually shows through the animal tissue, giving the coral reef its color that we know about today. This algae is called zooxanthellae, and zooxanthellae and corals have a symbiotic relationship. So coral gives zooxanthellae the nutrients it needs to survive, while the zooxanthellae gives coral sugars, which sugar can be used for energy. And in fact, this sugar provided by zooxanthellae can account for up to 95% of a coral's energy. So it's a significant source of energy for corals. And coral polyps use a lot of this energy to build these hard mineral structures called calcium carbonate or limestone rock. And this hard structure serves as the skeletal support beneath the living tissue of the coral. And in fact, when you look at a coral colony, only that very thin layer on the surface, just millimeters thick, is actually the living tissue or the living coral. This whole mass underneath it is the calcium carbonate skeleton that might be decades old. The slow growth of these polyps and expansion of this hard skeletal structures build up the permanent coral reef structure over time. So when you have multiple corals growing in an area, as well as other marine calcifiers, they build up this incredible foundation, forming a coral reef ecosystem. So in addition to being simply beautiful ecosystems that we love to explore, these reefs provide numerous ecosystem goods and services, many of which benefit human well-being. This coral reef can support a lot of other animals, algae, and plants living in the ocean. An estimated 25% of all marine life, including over 4,000 species of fish, are dependent on coral reefs at some point in their life cycle. The structure of coral reefs helps slow down incoming waves. In fact, the wave energy can be reduced up to 95% due to a presence of a reef offshore. For example, when Hurricane Irma approached the Florida Keys in 2017, the storm surge out by the reef was 25 feet. And this storm surge was reduced to 4 feet by the time it reached the islands. I don't think any of us can argue that Hurricane Irma was a devastating event, but just imagine how much more devastation would have been observed if the storm surge was actually 25 feet instead of 4 feet. And so these coastlines with these reefs experience less flooding, which benefits mankind and economies. So these graphs are comparing areas with reefs in blue and areas without reefs in red. So we can see the areas with reefs have less area flooded, less people flooded, less capital flooded, and therefore less capital damage. So obviously a very valuable ecosystem service these reefs are providing for mankind. And in addition to benefiting mankind, the reduction of wave energy by reefs also allow other ecosystems like mangroves and estuaries to form, adding even more protection from erosion to the coastline. Corals and sponges, as well as other animals on reefs, such as these cone snails, provide chemicals for defense against predators and competitors. And some of these chemicals have actually proven to be very successful in treating a wide array of human medical conditions, such as chronic pain, cancer, HIV, and Alzheimer's. More than 20,000 chemicals have been discovered to be useful as pharmaceuticals, with new discoveries every year. And finally, coral reefs provide sustenance and support healthy economies for many countries around the world. In Caribbean, small island developing nations, people consume 10 to 35 kilograms of fish per capita, and over 200,000 people are employed by fisheries, aquaculture, or supporting businesses. In addition, a recent study led by the Nature Conservancy estimated that reef-associated tourism generates almost $8 billion for Caribbean economies annually. So coral reefs are incredibly valuable economically as well as ecologically. However, these amazing ecosystems that provide all of these valuable goods and services to humans and the ocean are in trouble. Worldwide, scientists have documented the decline in the abundance of healthy reef-building corals. And so coral reefs that were once extremely colorful and had a lot of structural complexity, like you see in these top two images from Jamaica and the Florida Keys, are now flattened and more of a green or brown hue due to the algae overgrowing the dead coral skeletons. And this has been observed by many scientists who have been studying the ecology of Caribbean reefs since the 1970s, when coral ecology in the Caribbean really took off. And I just want to share a few quotes from prominent scientists in coral reef ecology that have documented the past glory of the Caribbean reefs. My boxes. Okay. The shallow reefs were an expansive tangle of complexly branched elkhorn coral that went on for miles and miles. In the water, I am accepted, suspended, carried along, or free to wander at will, to move among the brittle, beautiful corals. Watching the play of fish fulfills me as nothing I have ever known on earth. I was astonished to observe fields upon fields of vibrant, golden brown elkhorn and staghorn corals. So what impression did this first coral reef experience make on me? It was exhilarating, awesome, and magical. I regret that I can't find photographs that adequately illustrate what I clearly remember. And if you had told me in 1970 that the luxuriant coral reefs would look the way they do today, I would have said you were crazy. So what happened? And what will these reefs look like 100 years from now? So new evidence suggests that the earliest decline in important reef builders known as staghorn and elkhorn corals, or croppereds, occurred in the 1950s and 1960s. So these corals dominated Caribbean reefs for the last million years before this decline started. And we think this decline was most likely due to changes in water quality as human populations and therefore agricultural runoff started to increase during this time frame. And so this graph here on the bottom shows the relationship between the proportion of coral reefs dominated by elkhorn coral against human population. And we can see there's a very clear relationship here of decreasing dominance of elkhorn coral with increasing human population. So already in the 50s and 60s, we're seeing these Caribbean reefs respond to changes in the ocean. The Caribbean was subsequently hit by two disease outbreaks, or pandemics if you will, that wiped out populations of these acroprid corals, as well as diadema urchins during the 1970s and 1980s. White band disease combined with other factors like hurricane events wiped out 97% of these two species, staghorn and elkhorn corals. And there have been complete losses documented on some reefs in the Caribbean. Consequently, these two coral species are now listed in the Endangered Species Act. In the 1980s, we started seeing massive die-offs of these diadema sea urchins, and the mortality from this unknown pathogen was also quite high, about 93 to 100%, depending on what reef you were studying. And these urchins are really important herbivores on coral reefs. They munch on all that algae or seaweeds that can overgrow the corals or prevent recruitment of new corals from coming in. So the loss of these urchins in combination with overfishing and the weakened state of the corals from white band disease and other stressors allowed this fleshy macroalgae or seaweeds to kind of grow unchecked on the reefs in the Caribbean. And since the 1980s, there have been a steady decrease of coral cover on Caribbean reefs. The Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network released a report on the status and trends of Caribbean coral reefs in 2014. And so they analyzed data from ecological surveys conducted at 88 reefs across the Caribbean. And they produced basically this graph, which now shows an average of 15% live coral cover for Caribbean reefs. Throughout the Caribbean, there is variable coral cover. So the coral cover range from about 3% in Southeast Florida to just over 50% in the flower garden banks in the Gulf of Mexico. And the coral cover that we have been observing through SEA's Caribbean Reef Expedition have also kind of fallen within this range. And so now I just want to share a couple of examples of the reef we've been observing during the Caribbean Reef Expedition, particularly during last fall's cruise, C289. I know there's some of you on this call. This first video is going to show a reef from Isaac Bay in St. Croix, which is the US Virgin Islands. Strong currents unfortunately made the visibility not so great this day, but I can figure out how to get this. Let me see if I can get the sound off. Okay. All right, let's start that over again. Okay, so visibility is not so great, but you can still hopefully see this massive structure on the reef that was created by elkhorn corals that are still standing. And so this dead coral skeleton still standing kind of gives you a glimpse into the past of what Caribbean reefs used to look like back in the 70s or the 50s or 60s. And what is now growing on the skeletons is mostly a small carpet of algae called turf algae, and there was a very low abundance of live corals, soft corals, and other invertebrates. So it's mostly just this huge dead coral skeleton providing structure there. Turn off the volume before I start the video this time. Okay. In contrast, this is going to show a reef that we surveyed in Montserrat. Here, the reef is actually growing on top of these massive volcanic boulders, and we actually have very high coral cover compared to some of the other reefs that we surveyed. And so the student, Becca, is going to dive down here to give us a closer look at what the sea coral looks like. So we can see a number of sea urchins. That's all the little black tiny dots you see. Most of this yellowy coral is fire coral. We do see some brain coral, sponges, and lots of little fish swimming around. So this just gives you an example of what the reef looks like from kind of the other end of the spectrum. And I see a question here in the chat asking how we're determining percent cover, phototransects or swimming over bottom transects. I think the ecological survey, looking at the 88 different sites across the Caribbean, used a combination of these. Sea Education Association is primarily doing phototransects on these reefs. So those are just a couple examples of what coral reefs in the Caribbean look like now. So what will they look like in the future under a currently changing ocean? Get back on the slide. Okay. So in addition to the continuation of local human impacts like pollution and overfishing, coral reefs are facing global changes in ocean conditions. Three major changes include ocean warming, acidification, and deoxygenation. So global warming has been occurring in the ocean due to the increase in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So this graph is showing both historic and future projections of the surface seawater temperature changes. So we can see on the left side of this plot, left of this vertical line, the historical measurements in surface seawater relative to an average taken over this entire time period. And then starting from the vertical line towards the right, what we see are numerical projections of what temperatures might do in the future under different emission scenarios. So that's what these RCP numbers shown on the right of the screen are representing our different emission scenarios. So under a best case scenario, which is shown in blue here, which represents a massive decrease in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, it represents stopping all emissions today. We can see that we can kind of keep the temperature increase about 1.5 degrees Celsius. On the flip side, if we continue business as usual, we can see that temperature increase is expected to be much higher, about 4 degrees Celsius, which would have huge impacts on not only coral reefs, but other marine ecosystems as well. When the ocean gets too hot for long periods of time, it stresses out the corals. And when corals are stressed, the zooxanthellae leave the coral tissues. Now remember, the animal tissue is transparent. So when those green zooxanthellae leave that tissue, we can now see that white calcium carbonate skeleton underneath. Thus, it looks like the coral has bleached. This can happen at a variety of different spatial scales, including the global scale. And when we observe mass bleaching at regional or global scales, we refer to them as mass bleaching events. We've had 3 of these global mass bleaching events, and we might currently be in the middle of a 4th one right now. And scientists are confident that these mass bleaching events are going to become more frequent and more severe in the future as the oceans continue to warm. And I do want to say bleached corals are not dead. They're actually still alive, and they may recover once temperatures cool down, but it's still very hard on the corals for bleaching because they're more vulnerable to diseases and further damage from the sun. And remember, the zooxanthellae provide 95% of a coral's energy in some cases, so that's a huge loss in energy as well. Some species of bleached corals also may produce a fluorescent protein when they're stressed. So this fluorescent protein acts as a chemical sunscreen for the corals, protecting them from the harsh sun rays coming through the seawater. And so this causes corals to look like they're glowing green, purple, pink, red, blue, variety of different colors. And so this image on the left shows an incorporated coral on the Great Barrier Reef. And this photo was taken by Ocean Agency and Catlin Seaview Survey. You can also check out the documentary Chasing Corals for an excellent example of what a glowing coral reef looks like as it's bleaching. And this photograph on the right is a little bit harder to see the fluorescence, but if you look at the edges, you can see this coral is actually glowing green. And this was my first time seeing a glowing coral in the wild. And this was observed last fall during the Caribbean Reef Expedition. Okay, so moving on. Ocean acidification is another consequence of the increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This increase has been documented through direct measurements on Mauna Loa, which is a volcano in Hawaii, since the 1950s by scientists at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And so on this graph, we can see time on our x-axis going from the 1950s through present day, and there's CO2 or carbon dioxide concentration shown on the y-axis. So while there is some variability, overall we see this increase over time from the 1950s to present day. And scientists have also measured levels of carbon dioxide in bubbles trapped in ice to reconstruct an even longer time series of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So here we can see the natural variability or natural cycles of carbon dioxide increases and decreases due to glacial and interglacial periods. But when we reach present day all the way on the right side, we can see that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere far exceeds the levels that have been in the atmosphere over the past 800,000 years. It has also increased much faster than in history, which is challenging for plants and animals, including corals, that need time to adapt. So the oceans act as a sponge, absorbing some of this carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. So as you have an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time, about 26% of the carbon dioxide dissolves into the oceans. And so consequently, we start seeing an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in our oceans over time. And when carbon dioxide reacts with water, it undergoes a series of chemical reactions that ultimately lead to decreased seawater pH over time. and seawater pH is predicted to decline a further 0.3 to 0.4 units by the end of the century. This might not sound like a big number to you, but keep in mind that pH is a logarithmic scale, and so this seemingly small decrease in pH actually corresponds to a 150% increase in acidity. And these changes in seawater chemistry associated with ocean acidification makes it harder for animals and seaweeds to grow their protective hardened shells and exoskeletons. This includes many animals that we know and love, such as clams, crabs, lobsters, urchins, sea stars, shellfish, and our favorite, corals. Overall, coral growth may decrease up to 30% by 2100 under business as usual carbon dioxide emission scenarios. The general trend is about 15 to 25% decrease in coral skeletal growth under acidification. But this number does vary from one species to another, so some corals actually show resilience and don't seem to care about acidification, while other corals are more impacted. And we can also see that in these images on this slide as well. And so these images have a 1 centimeter scale bar here on the bottom, and they show coral fragments that have been growing in present day conditions or ambient conditions and acidified seawater for 1 year. And so if you compare the left and the right pictures, you can see that the corals growing in the acidified condition are generally smaller than the corals that were growing in the present day conditions, although there seems to be one coral species that did okay. And the main competitor for corals on reefs for space and resources are seaweeds, and these are just examples of some of the seaweeds that we can find on reefs. Seaweeds tend to either maintain their growth or they have increased growth under ocean acidification. This is because they use carbon dioxide to produce energy through photosynthesis, and so if you're putting more carbon dioxide in the seawater, they have more energy source for growth. In addition to these individual level responses, species interactions may also be indirectly affected by ocean acidification. And I'm sure some of you can think of examples of some of these species interactions, such as a shark eating a fish or an urchin eating algae. But I want to highlight some other examples as well. So this video is going to show 2 different coral species that are side by side in this tank. So right now they've got a little bit of space between these 2 different coral species. But in a minute, the scientists are going to move them closer together and we'll wait and see what happens. Okay, so this coral on the left really doesn't like having this coral right next to it. So it starts shooting this kind of spiderweb looking material at the other coral. So these are called mesenterial filaments. It's digestive filaments of the coral. And so this is one way corals can fight off competitors for space. So this coral literally digested and killed the tip of the coral colony living right next door to it. So it's just one example of a species interaction that might be altered under ocean acidification. And then here's another cool example of a species interaction that might be affected by acidification on coral reefs. In this video, you're going to see a basically giant boulder like you see in the background here. And all of this green stuff you see growing on the rock is a carpet of turf algae that has been farmed by fish living on the reef. However, this turf algae can attract other animals that like to eat the algae, like this urchin you see in the video. So we see this fish literally swimming after the urchin and trying its best to knock that urchin off of the reef, or off of its algae farm. So this is just another example of a species interaction that might be altered under acidification. And in fact, we have many different interactions going on here. So we have the urchin eating the algae, and we have fish fighting off the urchin. We also have fish growing the algae. And it's pretty incredible that that little fish can move that big urchin, in my opinion. Okay. So ocean acidification may facilitate or accelerate this transition we're currently observing of shifts from coral reefs or coral-dominated reefs towards the reefs dominated by seaweeds and sponges. And this can happen both through direct impacts on the physiology of individuals, as well as indirect impacts on ecological processes. And this is actually one of the scientific questions that really interests me and drives my own research. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about that research during the talk, but if you have questions at the end, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Okay. And then another major climate change issue is decreasing ocean oxygen levels. And so oxygen does decrease naturally at nighttime when respiration happens without photosynthesis. But oxygen levels have also been decreasing over a longer time scale because warmer water physically holds less oxygen. So as temperatures increase, oxygen decreases. The decomposition of phytoplankton after these massive phytoplankton blooms also removes the oxygen from seawater. And these phytoplankton blooms can occur in response to both natural and anthropogenic changes in environmental conditions, especially nutrient levels. This graph is showing the percent change in oxygen relative to a climatology from 1986 to present day, or until 2005, not present day. The red line here shows, again, historical observations, kind of purple on my screen. So we can see that there have been a decrease in oxygen observed in the ocean. And then once again, we've created numerical models to project what changes might look like under different emission scenarios. And so under the best case scenario, we can kind of maintain oxygen levels just under what has historically been observed. But under business as usual, we can see up to a 4 to 5% decrease in the amount of oxygen in the water. And the effects of deoxygenation on coral reefs have only recently received attention in the scientific community. This map shows oxygen levels that were measured around Panama in one study. So the areas shown in blue represent areas that have high, good levels of oxygen in the seawater, while the areas in the red and the orange show areas that have dangerously low oxygen levels. And in these areas where low oxygen or hypoxia was occurring, scientists started to observe coral bleaching and even coral mortality. These graphs show also the relationship between the oxygen level of the seawater and the percentage of corals that are alive on the top and the coral species richness on the bottom. And in both cases, what we see is that as oxygen levels in the seawater decrease, there's a less percentage of corals alive on the reef, and there's also a decrease in the coral species richness. But corals are not the only ones affected by deoxygenation on reefs. We also can see changes and effects on the invertebrate and vertebrate communities as well. And so this graphic is kind of summarizing what we know so far about how different coral reef organisms respond to either mild changes in oxygen or severe hypoxia or even anoxia in seawater. And so we can start to see in other organisms besides the reefs, we see a decrease in movement and feeding of lobsters. Some species will shift from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, meaning they're now starting to use, instead of oxygen, different chemicals to provide energy. And then also both fish and invertebrates will move towards areas with higher oxygen levels, which tend to be away from the seafloor. And so fish that are normally found near the seafloor, like eels, are now swimming at the surface of the water. And invertebrates move to outer upper surfaces of coral colonies. So in summary, coral reefs are very much socio-ecological systems. In other words, mankind is an important element in shaping these coral reef ecosystems. And this diagram here looks very complex, but it is basically showing the linkages and feedback between people and reefs. So social systems, or people, influence how people interact with coral reefs through fishing, pollution, and climate change. And that in turn affects the ecosystem goods and services provided by reefs, which in turn affects human well-being. So there's this nice chain reaction. So, although humans have had a negative impact on Caribbean reefs through overfishing, pollution, and climate change, we can also positively influence coral reef ecosystems through monitoring, restoration, and protection, especially through coordinated and combined efforts across local, regional, and global scales. So Sea Education Association is one institution that contributes to monitoring of coral reefs and ocean change in the Caribbean. We also educate and inspire ocean scholars, stewards, and leaders. We have two programs that are reef-centric, the Pacific Reef Expedition and Caribbean Reef Expedition. So the Caribbean Reef Expedition is typically offered in the fall semester. And like many of our programs, the Caribbean Reef Expedition not only focuses on the hardcore science and monitoring of ocean biology and chemistry, as well as coral reef biology and chemistry, but we also incorporate the human dimension in coral reef ecosystems through studies of marine environmental history, leadership, and marine policy. And our scientific mission is to document the health of coral reefs as well as global change and ocean conditions in the Caribbean, because this is really the first step towards understanding the drivers of coral reef ecosystems and identifying appropriate conservation measures. So this program is fairly new. We only have about 2-3 years of data so far, but eventually this will be a really powerful time series for informing policy and protection of coral reefs. And many other people are helping reefs by enhancing natural populations through a variety of coral restoration or gardening techniques. So this includes fragmentation, microfragmentation, and facilitated sexual reproduction. In 2016, there were over 150 coral restoration programs in the Caribbean, spread across over 20 different countries, which is pretty incredible. And altogether, these programs are planting tens of thousands of corals onto reefs. And so these photographs on the bottom here show an example of one restoration program called Fragments of Hope, located in Belize. In 2010, they outplanted 40 little staghorn coral fragments. So you can see one right here, I'm circling it, in Laughing Burn Cay National Park. And as you can see, these staghorn corals really started growing over time and eventually expanding to cover that seafloor. That's pretty incredible to see the influence of coral restoration on a reef. And this is a really great way to buy reefs more time until we can tackle the larger, more complex issues of global climate change. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of efforts within the Caribbean region to tackle environmental issues through education, monitoring, restoration, and protection. And I wish I had time to highlight all of these amazing efforts, but unfortunately, we only have an hour together. And as individuals, we can also help conservation of coral reef ecosystems, and these are just a few ways you can do that. So first, you can support your favorite marine research, education, and conservation groups. Many people choose to do this by donating either their time or money. Another way you can do this is by becoming a citizen scientist. So there's a little link posted here. If you have an iPad, you can click on this link to download a video game that was created by NASA. So in this video game, you learn how to identify corals, and then you mark it with a brush. And the data that is gathered during this game is sent back to NASA's servers so that their computers, supercomputers, can compare what you're doing in the game to lower resolution satellite data in order to learn how to identify coral itself through seawater. So by playing the game, you're actually helping NASA train their supercomputers. And a quote from one of the scientists who created this game says, "So far, even children are classifying coral with insane precision." So anyone can be a citizen scientist. Another way you can help reefs is by lowering your carbon, water, and plastic footprints. A few ways you can do this is by driving less and biking or walking more. I hope everyone is doing that these days. You can adopt a meatless Monday mentality. So the biggest way you can reduce your carbon footprint is actually by reducing your consumption of red meat. And so I'm not going to ask you to become vegan or vegetarian or anything that extreme, but if we can just eat a little bit less red meat, we would have a huge impact on our environment. Skip the straw, the very big movement to reduce plastic pollution, especially in the Florida Keys. So just tell the waitress you don't want a straw. And finally, bring your reusable bags with you when you go shopping. And so I always keep a few reusable bags in the trunk of my car, just in case. So if you're able, these are very simple things you can do that will have a big impact on your environmental footprint. Please share your knowledge and your concerns with your community. So talk to your family, your friends, your political representatives, the stranger you pass on the street. The more people that know about these issues, the more empowered we'll be to engender change. And finally, it can be easy to be consumed by archaeological grief due to visible signs of coral reef decline, but hold on to ocean optimism. So a few examples of this would be from the Sea Education Association cruise C289, which was the Caribbean Reef Expedition last fall. We did not observe any stony coral tissue loss disease, which has been rapidly spreading in some areas of the Caribbean. So that was very encouraging. In St. Croix, as well as the other islands, we learned about coral restoration and research efforts led by local communities and international organizations like the Nature Conservancy. When we visited Grenada, we were greeted by murals spreading messages about sustainability and coral conservation dotted across the entire island. And in Montserrat, we actually spotted a few healthy elkhorn and pillar corals, both of which are on the endangered species list. So that was a pretty special experience for us as well. And I'll leave you with one final thought, and that is we still have time. There's time to shape the future trajectory of not just Caribbean reefs, but coral reefs and the environment around the world in order to preserve these valuable, incredible ecosystems that we have come to love and depend on. So with that, I would like to wrap up the talk and thank you guys for your time and for being here today. My contact information is on here if you need to sign off a little bit early. I'm also happy to answer any questions right now. And if you enjoyed this talk, please check out the upcoming classes on the Quarterdeck. Our next talk will be on Thursday at 2 p.m. Titled Sailing to Mars via Earth's Newest Landmass by Dr. Carrie Whitaker. And then next week, these talks will actually take us back into the Caribbean. So if you really love the Caribbean, do check out the talks next week as well. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to gallery mode. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, so we have a question in the chat asking if we can please post the game link on the SEA website somewhere. I'm not sure if we can post it on the website, but this talk will be posted online as well. So you'll be able to access the link by looking at this talk online. So now we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. I'm actually happy to stay on as long as we need. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick. I can see everyone. Okay, so there's a few different ways you can ask a question here on Zoom. We have 70 participants. So I'm going to try to look at all of the boxes, but there's a lot of boxes to keep track of. So you can either ask a question by clicking on the reaction. So if you look at the bottom of your screen where you have options to mute and stop video, there should be a reaction button there. We can use the clap button. That kind of looks like a raised hand. You can also just type questions into the chat box. So I'll have the chat box open so you can ask your questions through there. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with the questions in the chat box because I see those first. So the first question from Kate says, outplanting efforts are great, especially for outreach, but aren't we simply outplanting corals to a compromised environment? Are there thoughts as how doing this contributes to genetic adaptation? That's a great question, Kate. I would say yes, there are some efforts to try to think about the, I guess, likelihood that these corals would survive in these compromised ecosystems. So, for example, at Moat Marine Laboratory, they're actually doing experiments on all the different genotypes of the coral fragments that they grow in their nurseries to see which of these genotypes respond best to ocean acidification, warming, and disease. And so then they can focus their restoration efforts on those genotypes. And other programs are also just trying to make sure we complement these fragmentation with sexual reproduction efforts so we can actually maintain that genetic diversity in the coral populations as well. So there is some effort to think about how we can best use restoration to restore not just coral populations, but these ecosystem processes. We have another question here. How are marine biologists studying the efficiency of different coral restoration techniques? That's also a great question. So right now, there's been some studies looking at how growing staghorn corals in the water column suspended off of lines versus growing them on the bottom affects their growth and physiology. And so that's one way we're looking at the efficiency of different coral restoration techniques. This science behind restoration is still very new, and so there's a lot we can still learn from restoration in order to keep improving our efficiency of different techniques that are out there currently. Okay. I can only see a third of you guys at once. I'm gonna flip through and see if there's any hands raised. Might be easier just to indicate in the chat box that you have a question that you either want to ask verbally or just type. Okay, a couple more questions here. Do areas with significant restoration efforts show notable drops in ocean carbon dioxide level, pH changes, etc.? That's a great question. As I alluded to, my PhD research was looking at how biological communities can alter the amount of carbon dioxide in the seawater and the seawater pH. And so if we're changing that biological community, we could conceivably be changing the seawater chemistry as well. I don't know of any studies that is specifically addressing your question, Logan, but that's a really great potential undergraduate or master's or PhD study for the future. Okay, we have a question from Katrina. Are there any benefits to a seaweed-dominated ecosystem versus coral-dominated ecosystem for these areas? Great question. I wish I had a really good answer for that. I don't think we know enough about the comparison of the ecosystem benefits of seaweed-dominated versus coral-dominated ecosystems. Although we can see that when you have those seaweed-dominated systems, they typically are less structurally complex, and so that would affect the amount of wave energy reduction that you have coming from offshore towards the coast. So again, really great future research question. Okay, this is a question from Norman. Lack of understanding is a big problem. I agree. I am a Massachusetts public school teacher. How can we get ocean standards and the state standards? Any ideas how this can be done? Looking for good units on the oceans for the middle school. Yeah, so NSF actually had a really great program called the GK-12 program, where they partnered graduate students with local middle school and high school teachers in an effort to use ocean science to teach these core standards both at national and state levels. So some of these lesson plans are available online. I can send you a link if you're interested. Norman, if you want to send me your email at some point. And this is something I'm really interested in doing as well. I think incorporating ocean sciences into curriculum for middle school and high school will really increase engagement with that scientific material. So I hope we can continue to have more programs like that NSF program. And you can also partner with science institutions like the Education Association. So, okay, this is a question from Elena. There has been a notable decrease in air pollution during the pandemic. Has there been any change in temperature, acidification, coral health documented recently? Trying to think if I've seen anything on how seawater chemistry has responded to the pandemic. I personally haven't seen any studies published yet on that, but we do have monitoring systems out in the ocean that are constantly monitoring temperature, acidity levels, oxygen levels, etc. And so we can eventually look back at these data sets to see if there was a change in our ocean conditions in response to the decrease in air pollution during the pandemic. But ultimately, it depends on what we decide to do from here on out, right? Are we going to maintain our current levels of air pollution, which are currently low, or are we going to return to business as usual? So I think this is a really critical turning point for us in deciding as a community which trajectory we want to pursue in the future. Okay. Timothy said, you mentioned recent effects from runoff. Was there a measurable known effect from the historical plantation era when so many islands were wall-to-wall sugar crops? Timothy, I'm going to encourage you to attend the talk next Thursday by Dr. Craig Marin, who will be talking about that exact same topic. So I imagine Craig will have some insights as to how these historical plantation eras specifically affected the coral reefs. Okay, thanks for your email, Norman. I see that there in the chat. Kate asked Norman, are you familiar with the Ocean Literacy Framework? K through 12 resources might have to lobby to get into state standards. So there have been efforts to try to get oceans into our standard curriculums, but there's still a lot more work to be done. Some discussion in the chat about ocean literacy. Looks like there's lots of resources out there. This is great. So it looks like there's a lot of different education resources. So perhaps by combining all of our great minds together, we can really start to move this effort forward into getting oceans into our middle school and high school curriculums. Thomas asked if we would like to see a video of some healthy staghorn. I would love to see it. I don't know about you guys. Thomas. Yeah, Thomas, if you would mind maybe turning on your mic and showing us the video.
Oh, yeah. I'll try to share the screen. Let's see how it goes. Okay. There we go. This is a couple weeks ago in Bonaire.
Is this a restoration site?
Say that again. What kind of site?
Is this a coral restoration site?
No,
okay.
No. This is been preserved. There are several restoration projects going on in Bonaire, and you can see them up and down the coast of the leeward side of the island. But no, this is just a really nice bit of staghorn. So yeah.
Hey, Tom, it's a nice fish too. Let's not forget the fish.
Yeah, right. No, the fish. Thank you. Yes, it's a lovely trumpet fish there. They love this coral.
Yeah.
You can always see them, nose down around the coral, and they also really like soft coral. You didn't talk too much about soft coral. Could you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, so in addition to increasing algae on reefs, we're also seeing an increase in the abundance of soft corals. In fact, the advertisement for this talk, you saw a lot of those soft corals in Bermuda. There hasn't been too much effort to understand how global change is affecting the soft corals on the reefs, but I think that, again, this is a growing field of study and interest to people. Okay. I can still only see a third of the people. I'm flipping through real quick. I don't see any hands raised. Are there any more questions before we sign off?
Heather, can I ask a question about fish?
Sure.
You showed a diagram that indicated that fish are going anaerobic in order to deal with lower oxygens. typically we don't think of vertebrates as anaerobic animals or animals that do well under anaerobic conditions. I looked at the paper that you cited there, and I saw that that figure was taken directly from the paper. I know the information might be in that paper, but can you say something about what they mean by fish being anaerobic? Because that's a very unusual statement.
Yeah. So typically animals use aerobic metabolism, right? So we are breathing in oxygen and using that to create energy. But some marine animals, especially those that live in deeper sea environments, don't need oxygen. They can actually switch to anaerobic metabolism where they're using different chemicals from the seawater to fuel their energy. And so I'd have to look back at the paper to see exactly which species they were talking about there.
Yeah,
but,
I just wanted to
Yeah.
point that out because that was a very unusual statement, not from you,
Yeah.
but from that paper.
Yeah.
So I will go back and read that paper. So thank you. It's a good one.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really excited to see what else comes out of this ocean deoxygenation studies in the future, now that we're thinking about it.
Yep.
Okay. So I am being aware of our time. It's 3:05 right now. So if you need to leave, I know it's been over an hour. Thank you guys for being here. It's wonderful to see so many faces and to meet so many new people. This talk will be posted on SEA's YouTube and Vimeo channels. So I think we'll let you know when we get those talks posted online if you want to view them at a later date. So, again, thank you guys all for being here. I'll stay on the line for a few more minutes.
Yeah, Heather, it's Ken Potter here, and for Thomas as well, I just wanted to say that I was in Bonaire in 1998 on the first trip there on the Corwith Kramer. I was engineer. I've dove all around the world, but that was some of the finest diving I've ever done, was in Bonaire.
Yeah, I've heard amazing things about Bonaire, and I'm dying to get in the water there myself.
We go in March every year for 2 weeks, and we get a 2-bedroom condo, and just so that we can invite people along for a week. So if you want to, it's booked for next March, but the March after that, if you speak up, you might get the other bedroom.
Yeah, sign me up.
That may be a mistake to him.
What's going on with SCA and the crisis? Can you fill us in, Heather?
So SEA is doing their best to think about risk assessment right now. So we really have the safety of the students and the crew at the forefront of our minds as we're moving forward, planning summer and fall programs. Unfortunately, yeah. And we do have constant updates on our website. So if you go to sea.edu, I think right on that homepage, there's a COVID-19 response. So you can see kind of some of the programming changes that we've had to unfortunately make tough calls on. But we're determined to keep bringing science into the community, and we hope to continue offering faculty lecture series and educational programs.
Heather, do you mind saying a little bit about how you ended up working for SEA and your career path? I'm just kind of curious how you got interested in this, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I got interested in marine biology at a young age. I was only 9 years old. So I just tried to get as many experiences as I could growing up. So doing science fairs, and eventually in high school, I had the opportunity to start volunteering at an aquarium, the Newport Aquarium, located in Kentucky, not the one on the other coast. So that really kind of solidified my desire to do marine biology. So I decided to go to UNC Wilmington for undergraduate, where I did a variety of research experiences, took a lot of hands-on learning courses, and also studied abroad twice. And yeah, I just fell in love with research. I really enjoyed studying ocean acidification because it seemed to combine all of my passions, which was marine invertebrates and chemistry, biology, environmental science. From there, I took a year off between my undergraduate and graduate to work in a coral ecology and oyster ecology lab. And so I eventually did my graduate education and did the postdoc at Moat. I actually found SEA when I was looking for jobs as I neared my PhD graduation. They were advertising for a different position at that time. It was science coordinator. So we have a fabulous person now, Kim Reed, who handles all of our science coordination for us. But through that job posting, I was able to do an interview and meet some of the people remotely, like we're doing now. And eventually we kind of all decided, okay, well, we don't know if this is the best fit, but we think maybe faculty position could be a good fit. So when the faculty position was advertised a few months later, I took a shot and applied for it. And I'm really thankful to be here now. It's kind of crazy to think at one point I thought I was just going to do research and not teaching at all. But, you know, through different experiences, you start to kind of wander around different career options. And
Yeah. The ocean acidification thing, there's a group called Concord.org. Are you familiar with them?
Called what?
Concord.org. It's a Concord consortium is what it's called, but they have a they have a modeler for ocean acidification. Like the kids build a model of how ocean acidification works. I'll put a link in the chat just because it's you know, it's an educational tool, but I think it's got a wide application for not so much modeling probably on your end because it'd be way more complex, but for kids to understand what a model is.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I'll throw it in there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question here asking, what are your favorite dive and snorkeling sites? Oh boy. I will say my favorite dive that I've ever done was actually in Bermuda. So if you dive in Bermuda on Hog Reef, the coral cover is amazing. It's 80 to 100% coral cover. So my PhD advisor actually surprised me by letting me do a dive on my birthday on that reef. And so that's probably one of my favorite dive sites for exploring what a healthy reef looks like. But you can access many amazing places via snorkeling as well. So during the Caribbean Reef Expedition, I really enjoyed snorkeling all of the different reef sites that we saw. They each had their unique, features. I would say Montserrat was probably one of my favorites during that trip that we did in the fall. But ask me again in 6 months and I'll probably give you a different answer. Just so much to see. Okay. Yeah, so Ken Potter has dove on that reef when he worked at BIOS. The BIOS is Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. I've actually done some work there as well. So, fantastic place.
Yeah, I was chief engineer on the Atlantic Explorer. That was my role there. So,
oh, cool.
The Atlantic Explorer.
Nice. Okay. Right. A lot of people have signed off. All right, so if there's no last minute questions, I think we're going to go ahead and sign off on this. So again, thank you guys for being here today. It's been wonderful chatting with all of you. Norman, I hope we can continue talking about education at the middle school and high school levels.
I'd like that.
Yeah.
Very much. Yeah. I'm in Massachusetts, so it just seems crazy to me that Massachusetts doesn't have more science standards, on oceans. Anyway, that'd be fun to talk to.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll send you an email. Hi, everyone. Stay healthy, stay happy, stay sane. We hope to see you on Thursday at Carrie's Talk. Have a great day, everyone.